And digging into one of our top stories this morning with the aforementioned Economist Dr Payne, Saudi Arabian GDP contracting by just under 1% for 2023. One of our headlines this morning, and it comes just a day after PMI data for January showed that private sector growth, while still growing, was growing at the slowest rate in 2 years. Dr Payne is in Riyadh. He's now the Chief Research Officer for Coldwell Banker Saudi Arabia. Chris, it's lovely to speak to you. Good morning.
Lovely to be back on the show. Good morning to you.
And Mabruk, new job, new country.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's great. Thank you.
And how convenient to have you now as a resident of Saudi. So let's look at those GDP numbers. The growth rate dropping by around 1% in 2023 and a contraction of more than 9%, 9.2% when it came to oil activities. Where is the Saudi economy at the moment?
Yeah, so, and I think, we've discussed this before, I think, Brandy, but, what's really important when you look at all the economies of the region is to look at non-oil GDP and non-oil GDP growth. So, if you look at the fourth quarter, oil production was down 16% in Q4 of 2023 versus Q4 2022. But we knew that because obviously we know that OPEC is quite transparent about its production cuts, and we know that Saudi is producing significantly less oil, about 9 million barrels a day. What really matters, though, is non-oil GDP, because oil is really, it's not telling you about the price, it's just telling you about production volumes. And actually, if you look at the fourth quarter of 2023, non-oil GDP was actually growing in the region of 4.5% year over year, which is actually a higher rate of growth. And I think it was something like 3.5% in Q3 2023. So actually, we saw an acceleration of the levels of growth in the Q4 of the non-oil GDP part of Saudi's GDP. And actually, quarter on quarter, if you look at it seasonally adjusted, it was growing at 2.5%, which is the highest rate of growth we've seen in 2 years. So again, we don't have further detail on GDP numbers at the moment. It's just the flash results for the fourth quarter and for the full year. But actually, the non-oil GDP is growing quite strongly. So put aside these kind of negative numbers. There is no way we're talking about a recession here. That's purely about production volumes. But obviously, PMI, as you mentioned, the Purchasing Managers Index in January, saw a slight slowdown month on month from sort of 57.5 to something like 55.5. Anything over 50 is still growth, but we may be seeing slightly lower rates of growth at the beginning of the year than we were seeing at the end of the year. I mean, this isn't surprising, really. A couple of reasons I venture, which are, number one, obviously there is a great deal of uncertainty in the region. We all know it. And I think I wouldn't be surprised if companies maybe decide to lower their inventory levels rather than putting in new orders. So that's one particular reason. But also, economies don't just grow in a straight line, and we've had very high levels of growth for 2 years. We may be taking a slight little pause, a little collective breath before moving on. But the headline numbers about GDP, going back to that, really don't capture what's going on here at all.
Yeah, look at some of the language in this PMI report that causes one to pause, to use your language. It's talking about, and while saying that the activity in new orders do continue to grow strongly, that there is slowing demand momentum, the rates of expansion have softened. It's a forward-looking report as well as one that looks at what's already happened. It said that business expectations for the upcoming year have dropped, the second weakest since mid-2020. Firms concerned about inflationary pressures, they think they could limit business expansion. What is the outlook for the private sector in Saudi at the moment?
Well, again, as I said, I mean, I think I think this collective breath really captures it quite well. I mean, there is the uncertainty that I talked about. However, and I can sort of now, focus on what I'm seeing. I don't think we're seeing any slowdown in plans. I mean, if you're looking at the way that people are contemplating using land, whether it be greenfield sites or redevelopment sites, there's still a huge intention to move forward with those plans. And I think if you look at the bigger level, I mean, PIF, for instance, have announced additional giga projects. I think we're moving from a period, I think, where you could talk about sort of planning for growth and major development into actually beginning it, breaking ground, that kind of stage. And I think it's at that moment that yes, okay, you may see a slight slowdown, and then the expectations here, I would say, are for then things to sort of motor forward as the year goes on. I mean, none of us know the future, but I think that's kind of the way we'd see it on the ground here.
You mentioned the giga projects, and obviously the Saudi government forecasting itself a deficit. At the same time, we have an ability to make money through a share sale of Aramco, and that Bloomberg report that a long-slated second share sale could happen within months. How do you read the timing of that?
Well, I think that there's been these two stories about Aramco, haven't there, in the last week or so, about not increasing capacity, say from 12 million barrels of oil a day to 13 million barrels of oil a day, and at the same time announcing an additional share sale. And both of those measures really, I mean, who owns majority of Aramco? Well, it's the government and PIF. And both of those measures are about raising cash to some extent. I mean, less capex means more money is available to be distributed to shareholders. And at the same time, obviously, selling down shares means one entity is selling down their shares in order to raise money. And both of those, what that really signals to me is more money for investment projects. I mean, again, PIF, people think of PIF as a sort of a pot of gold. Well, it isn't. It's actually largely invested in domestic projects, transformational projects. And I think that requires, obviously, you can't, some of this is locked up. Liquidity is required to invest in new projects. So I actually think, to me, and it can be read various ways, but to me, it's about raising money to continue with the pace of expansion and to get moving some of these investment projects, which is why I sort of come back to what I said before, which is that, I think Saudi is preparing itself for the next stage, which is really rolling out these large developments.
You mentioned what it feels like on the ground, Chris, and we've got a minute left with you. One of the things that popped up in this PMI report was increased competition, greater competition between companies, which is pushing prices down a little. And we know from real estate agents that it's also causing, massive competition for apartments and villas to live in as more people move into Saudi Arabia to work on these projects. What does that competition with more companies moving in, fulfilling regional HQ requirements, feel and look like on the ground? What are you seeing?
Well, I think that most people say the same thing, which is it's very difficult. Oh, excuse me. It's very, very difficult to actually find necessarily find apartments or dwellings that people absolutely fill their requirements, which I think only goes to really tell you that to meet those 2030 vision goals with regards population, then you're going to need to see significant developments. I mean, it's well understood here that land needs to be developed into residential units, that there needs to be more infrastructure, whether it be housing or education, in order to grow the expat community. So yes, I mean, we see that now. It's very, very clear, but that also gives you a path to what needs to be done in order to fulfill that vision. And you realize, being here, that everyone understands that vision, everyone wants to achieve that vision, and that really points to significant growth.
Dr. Chris Payne from Coldwell Banker Saudi Arabia, Chief Research Officer, thank you for your time.
By 103.8.
Join the conversation.